Okay, we're live. We'll go ahead and get started. Before we start the meeting, I'll read the following. In accordance with Utah Code Section 52-4-207, subsection 4 of the Utah Open and Public Meeting Act, I have determined that conducting an electronic meeting of the Centerville Planning Commission with an anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. This determination is based on the facts and circumstances surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. Considering the continued number of COVID-19 case counts in Utah, meeting in an anchor location presents substantial risk to the health and safety of those in attendance because physical distancing measures may be difficult to maintain at City Hall. So let's go ahead with that preface. Let's get started with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I have asked Commissioner Daly to give us a thought or legislative prayer, so I will turn the time over to him.
Great. I'll try and make this pretty quick. One of the things for those of you who've been around for a while, you know that I like to take a minute sometimes and do this and talk a little bit about the history of Centerville and try and tie it in a little bit to how that pertains to planning and how we maybe have planned in the past or how that could help us plan in the future based on history. So, you know, we just got done a month ago, it was a little over a month ago, with a pretty good windstorm, lots of damage. We're definitely known for our windstorms. But, you know, there are other natural disasters, I guess, that hit Centerville every once in a while. And actually, the host has disabled screen sharing. Can I share my screen for just a minute? Who's the host?
Mackenzie is the host today, so give her a second.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, you should have access now.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so there have been other natural disasters. So here is a picture. We can all see that. This is Centerville. The caption says 1927. Funny thing is that it might be 1930. I've got my reasons for thinking that it might be that. But anyway, what you see there, the big building kind of in the upper left, is Centerville Elementary, the old Centerville Elementary, in roughly the same place as the current Centerville Elementary. But what this is a big flood that came down out of Parish Canyon and Parish Creek and covered a huge area all through the heart of, well, kind of the north heart of Centerville, I guess you'd say. So that's a big chunk of debris. And here's another picture. This is, again, Centerville. Not exactly sure where this one is, but it's kind of in that same area there. And then here is one more I wanted to show. Look at the size of those rocks that came down, those boulders that came down out of the mountain, out of the canyon, and damaged a whole bunch of stuff. One of the things that was interesting about this is that they didn't really, it was too much to clean up and get rid of. So in a lot of cases, they just kind of leveled it out and left it, and essentially raised the elevation of Centerville in a way. One of the things that has been done since then is during the Depression, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, did some terracing. And this is a picture up above North Salt Lake, but there's some of this similar terracing up above Centerville. And the purpose of that is to try and prevent things from just letting loose on the mountain and rushing down the canyons and wiping everything out. The other thing that's been done kind of planning wise more recently, and I don't have a picture of this one, is the big retention basin that's up Centerville Canyon to hold back Dual Creek. Because interestingly enough, Centerville Canyon is one of the few canyons around that has not had a recorded flood or big landslide like some of the other canyons have. But so yeah, floods are a thing in Centerville, just like wind, less frequent, and hopefully now we can prepare for the floods and, you know, the terracing and the retention basins and not have to deal with those as much. And just an interesting little tidbit of Centerville history. That's all I've got, Shaylin.
Kevin, I always love that you pull out history, and it it maybe gives me a little bit of faith that there were prior years that were as bad or worse than this 2020, right? So very, very interesting though. I appreciate those thoughts. All right, we have two substantive matters of business. The first is a legislative decision involving a zoning text amendment. This involves residential buffering, CZC 12.51. So I'll turn the time over to staff.
Okay, so I'm just bringing up the staff report. And whoops, this is the wrong one. This is the second one, right? Let me get the other one. Residential bufferings first, correct? Okay, so I'm bringing up the staff report and I'm just scrolling around to the staff's recommendation. Just to highlight two components in your last meeting, I think it was the end of August or so forth. We talked about the residential buffering and two objectives. One was to keep it simple, and the other one was to give an out, some type of escape that was talked about. So I've gone back in to bring this up to simplify it. I'm basically just recommending now that we not get into the debate about the commercial intensity zone and maybe think about just matching medium for medium and then adjusting the high. So I'll just explain that real quick. It's going to, the proposed language is adds residential buffering to the landscaping section of the ordinance. If you go to the residential section of the ordinance, it references that the landscaping may be applicable to any development in a residential zone. And so rather than place it in the residential base zoning, I'm recommending we put it in chapter 1251. And we just simply now add residential buffering as part of the buffering standards. I went with the 15 feet for the medium zones. I think that's a discussion. Are you worried about the differentiation between residential medium and residential low? But I'm matching that with the commercial medium and assuming that those values will stay similar. The second one is the high. If you look at the commercial, we have a high and we have a very high. And in the commercial, it's an automatic 30 feet. I've softened that to match the council's discussion. During their discussion, they were saying they would like to see the high be somewhere at 25 feet. And so I am just assuming, since we don't have a very high and it's residential use, rather than force the 30-foot requirement, maybe we can back it off 5 feet to the 25-foot requirement. And so those are the three major changes: adding residential buffer, using 15 feet for the medium zones like we do with the commercial, going with the 25 feet discussed by the council for the high, residential high. And then your issue of the escape route, if we add this to section 1251 landscaping in the code, you should be familiar with the waiver of strict compliance that's in the same chapter. That waiver of strict compliance in that chapter applies only to this chapter. And so I've cut and pasted the language for you in the staff report to show you those are the findings or the escape route you have to make. And if we add it to the residential, or we add it to the landscaping section, I think the escape route is there. And the findings, whether it's commercial or residential, become consistent with each other, but gives you that escape route that you're looking for, that you discussed. So those are my recommendations to date.
Thanks, Corey. I have a question before I open it up to everybody. So if making sure that I'm reading this correctly, under your proposal, if I have a medium intensity zone that abuts a low intensity zone, then I would need a 15-foot buffer. And if I have a high intensity zone that is abutting a medium intensity zone, I would go with the higher buffer, the 25, correct?
Or even if it's a lower intensity, the 25 would apply to anything lower.
So, okay, that's what I thought.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions for staff?
I've got one. Corey, at the risk of embarrassment, can you just help us remember, at least for this chapter's sake, the difference between buffering and setbacks so that we're all on the same page.
Sure. I think of it, the best way to put it is setbacks are, the fancy term is bulk area regulations inside a base zone. So let's just take a single family home zone, RL. Bulk area setbacks are front yard is 25 feet, side yards are 8 and 10, rear yards are 20. So that's the bulk area for every single parcel that exists inside of that base zone. And those are those minimums you have to be. No closer than 25, no closer than 8 and 10, no closer than 20. A buffer is like a setback, but now it's not applied to every lot line in a parcel. It's applied where a parcel may adjoin a lot line with an adjacent lower or differing zone. And that buffer now trumps that setback, whatever that setback standard. So an example is if it was a side setback of 8 feet, just because your parcel's in the zone that allows an 8-foot side setback, if that property line is adjacent to a lower intensity zone, the buffer trumps that and pushes it to 15 or 25.
So I think that last couple sentences, I think keys in on it. Buffers and setbacks are cumulative or contemporaneous or overlaid on top of each other. They're not in addition to each other, correct?
They wouldn't be in addition to each other in the sense of not every parcel has the same configuration. It would just be the trump card for that adjacent line that would say, okay, your base zone is 8 feet, but because you share a boundary with a different district, it overlays over the top and says your buffer now goes to 15 or 25, depending on your zone.
Correct, not +8.
Correct, not +8.
Okay, that's all the question I have. Thank you.
Any other further questions for staff?
Can you just let us know, Corey, about the commercial is just like Shaylin said, when it goes from larger intensity to lower intensity, it would still be like that 25 with the commercial as well?
The commercial would be 15 and 30.
15 and 30, okay. So the 25 was, can you just reiterate that really quickly? What was the 25?
If your parcel is within an RH zone and you're developing that parcel, the boundary line, if it by chance shares a common boundary with a lower density, then the 25 feet applies along that boundary line regardless of what the setbacks are.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for staff?
I have a question that I probably should know the answer to, but I'm really curious because I didn't get the time to dig in. Corey, if a residential area abuts something besides commercial, what landscape buffers would apply?
Let me repeat that so I make sure I got the scenario. If a parcel, just help me clarify that one more time.
Sure. If a zone that's abutting the residential area is not a commercial zone, but is say an industrial or I don't know what other zones.
Public facility.
Public facility and then ag. I don't know if we need to worry about ag particularly, maybe ag medium, but do we need to consider whether or not this covers that, or is that covered somewhere else in the code?
The burden is always the more intensive zone. And so if you are residential and the adjacent zone to you is more intensive, then the buffer doesn't apply to you because the other zone's required to carry the burden of the buffer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but Corey, so let me ask you this. Maybe this is what Mason's asking, or maybe it's not what Mason's asking, but if you have residential that happens to abut industrial, the way it's written here, that industrial zone wouldn't have to do any buffering because it's not commercial?
No, it doesn't exempt the industrial zone from applying for the buffer.
Do we need to be a little bit more explicit in that though? Commercial and industrial minimum buffer depth, or Is
Yeah,
it?
you could call that out under, yeah, so that you have it more explicit. Commercial/industrial.
And do we need to worry? I mean, that's where I was headed. And Kevin, you're more articulate. I guess what I'm wondering is, why does the word commercial appear only in this proposed legislation when, as I see it, perhaps there are other zones that might need to have this apply to that as well?
No, I think you're making a good point because it was automatically just assumed non-residential development. So you make a good point. We need to change commercial to say non-residential development or commercial/industrial. That's a good catch.
Yeah, and I would say, just kind of piggyback on that, I would say you're right, Mason, maybe not agricultural. I don't think we really have an agricultural medium. That's not
We
really
do,
a
but
fit.
it doesn't exist we have it in code format, but not physically on the ground.
Right. So commercial and industrial, I mean, I threw out public facility, but well, I guess we could put that on there too, just for
Right.
consideration.
Maybe just
I
call
like
it
the idea of
non-residential.
Yeah, non-residential. And that's part of the reason
Non-residential.
why I asked that question too, because of all kind of this same thing. So non-residential to me seems to cover it all.
Sounds good to me.
No, that's a good catch.
Corey, quick question while you take that note. The other question that I had is, what is the buffer on residential low intensity?
We're assuming that low does not need to buffer itself to agricultural in this version of the edits.
But low to commercial, low residential, or low to say low to medium residential.
Then the buffer on the medium would be 15 feet.
Okay, because I think if I recall correctly, back in our August discussion, there was some conversation about going 15, 20, 25 between low, medium, and high on the residential. Am I mistaken on that, or does anybody else remember that?
No, I brought up that philosophical point. Do we want to meddle into the commercial buffer to try to create consistency with the 30 and the 15? But if I remember correctly, I said the properties that are commercial medium on Main Street are very small. So if you increase it to 20, that burden is increased by not quite an exponential amount, but a significant amount. So I'm backing off and just saying mediums are 15, whether it's residential or commercial.
I guess what I'm saying, but you're saying in the way it's written, you're saying differing lower intensity residential zone district. It could be from a low to medium or a medium to high within the residential.
Yes.
And so is there, yeah, okay.
Yeah, differing lower intensity residential district, or the edit with the non-residential development to a differing residential intensity district.
Okay.
Any other questions for staff?
I have a question for a clarification, Corey. There's a sentence in here that says landscaped buffers shall be required alongside and rear property boundaries, which abut a residential zone, etc. Can you explain in different words what you mean by shall be required alongside and rear property boundaries? And the ultimate question is geared towards what would an enterprising or less than ethical developer try to do with that language? Because it seems loose, and I'm looking for if there's play in the joints for what you mean.
I think we just need a space between along and side.
That's what I was going to say. I think that's along side and rear property boundaries.
Yeah, I see what you're looking at. Yeah, there needs to be a separation.
Okay, that makes sense now.
That's cut from the code, so that's probably the way it's written in the code.
Let's fix it.
What, there's a typo in the code?
That's a direct.
Never,
copy.
Lisa, never. It's perfect.
I can go fix it right now. You keep talking.
Any other questions for staff? If not, this has been scheduled for a public hearing, so we'll take the opportunity to invite any member of the public who wishes to speak. Seeing no one else participating in our meeting, I'll close the public hearing. And okay, any further questions for staff? Since nobody asked before, I'm guessing no new ones. Any discussion or debate on this?
Just one real quick one. Did the sun already set for somebody? We've had a long meeting.
Yeah, it's set here. So I'm sorry, I'm dark. I'm trying to like stay under the one little light I have. So sorry, guys.
I will just lead off with this one by saying that I am in favor of changing commercial to say non-residential and to fix the space between along and side. I'm still not convinced that we need a buffer between adjoining residential zones. I'm still in favor of it if we have 2 degrees of separation. So from a high to a low, I would absolutely be in favor of it. Or if we ever have a very high to a medium, I would do that. I am not in favor of voting. I don't think that we need buffers between adjacent residential types, but that's just me.
Can you kind of expound on that a little bit? Like the reason is just because it's a natural going from one to another, or because we already have setbacks in the code that prevent stuff from being too close? What's your reasoning?
Both of those things. I mean, I think that our plan is set up to try to transition it. That's naturally the way that it functions anyway. Seems like it's been working generally fine up until now. I'm of the opinion if it's not broke, don't fix it. But I am in favor of 2 degrees of separation to have a buffer, or a buffer, obviously, if it's between different types of uses. So commercial and residential for sure. That makes sense to me, but I might be alone on that. Anyone else have any comments?
I don't think you're alone on that. I don't think that, I appreciate that Corey has gone back and made it a little more simplistic instead of, we talked about whether we wanted it simple or whether we wanted it to be complex. I like that there's simplicity, and I think what you're arguing for is even more simplicity, that allows the natural way that it's been set up already to take that into account. And then if there is more intense differentiation, that would warrant probably a buffer.
So I'd like to piggyback off that and kind of draw that conversation out a little bit, Shaylin, and understand it better. So if you have 2 residential zones that are next to each other, you can't, we don't have a very high residential, correct?
We don't at this point, right? Am I right, Corey? No very high yet.
Correct. No very high yet.
So the only way you're going to get two degrees of separation is if you have residential low next to a residential high. And in your mediums, you're going to get townhomes, which can have multiple stories. And when you're just looking at setbacks next to, say, a residential low, and somebody has a swimming pool back there, I could see cause for why somebody might grow rather concerned, and that a landscape buffer might be a good idea.
I mean, yes, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I can also have 2 low residential properties abutting and have somebody build a very high, very big building that does the same thing.
Or a deck.
Or a deck, or right. So I mean, I understand the concern. I do. I just am not persuaded that it's necessary to make a change to the code between where you only have 1 degree of separation. I just don't think it's necessary myself.
Well, we also talked about the differences in residential low properties where there might be, quite a difference in elevation of one property to another with like a retaining wall or different things like that. And there still are issues within the same, level, residential level, low or high or whatever that could exist that aren't even based on that. So I understand that exists, and kind of going along with what Mason was saying, if there were some sort of situation where there was a quite a big difference with a retaining wall or something, and it went from residential low to residential medium, that would be quite a bit different that could cause some issue, I think, too.
And I'll pick a question back up. Can I address a question to Corey, Madam Chair?
Of course.
So Corey, I have a question for you. This is a crystal ball gaze, so it's an unfair question. If we impose additional landscape buffering requirements on residential areas as they start to, either fill in Centerville or whatnot, is that going to increase development costs, and therefore is that going to potentially have an impact on our low-income housing?
I can give you the subjective answer rather than the objective data. I think that is a fair concern about adding too much buffering, because there's the two trains of thought here. We want to protect our neighborhood areas of single family from encroachment of commercial. Now we're saying we want to protect them encroachment from the multifamily. So I think that's a value judgment that has some merit to it. But I think the subjective cause of it is when you start creating where you're competing with how much landscaping. So like you have to have a 40%. If you're a non-single family project, you're required to have 40% landscaping with the project, with 50% of it sitting within the common space of that project. I think when you add the residential buffer, that's the first place that they're going to run with the landscaping. They're going to run it over instead of between units, instead of parking stalls, instead of separation units. They're going to run that landscaping all the way over to that boundary line and try to take that buffer and get as much of that buffer that gives them that percentage. If that causes a detriment to layout and parking, yeah, then you're starting to affect how the units are created, how desirable they are they marketable? I'm absorbing 25 feet of the cost of this land that's multifamily, which is going to be a significant value to that land because of that density allotment. And that's disappearing under these landscaping and buffering requirements. And so my unit costs go up per acre. So I think subjectively, yes, you're not helping the cause of lowering the price of the housing per se.
And then asking,
it would only be a differential though, Corey. It's not like the developer is going to absorb the full 25-foot buffer. They're absorbing the differential between what's already in place and the 25. And when you're talking about a large project, speaking as a developer, it's not going to move the needle a whole bunch.
And that may be the case, yeah. That's why I said it's a subjective concern. I don't know what I could say objectively. Yeah. I mean, Centerville, to be honest with you, we're building $350,000, $400,000 units. Yeah, it's more affordable if you're semi-affluent, but it's not affordable if you're income restricted. Either way.
Any further discussion on this one?
My quick 2 cents, Shaylin, I'm going to disagree with you on this one. I actually kind of like the degrees of separation just from a stepping into, just that little extra. I'm more in favor of that little extra differentiation. That's just my personal opinion. So,
yeah, I figured I might be out alone on this one. And for what it's worth, I don't feel strongly about this one either way, but as between the two, I tip towards, I guess I tend to want to put fewer restrictions on property where I can. So if I don't feel like I have to put this restriction on property, I don't want to do it, but that's just my bent. Any other discussion on this one? If not, the chair will entertain a motion.
How about I try my first entertaining a motion? I don't know if I'll do this right, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I move to approve the landscape buffer text changes as proposed by staff. Planning Commission finds that council directed the Planning Commission and city staff to review and sections A, B, C, D, etc. Did I do that right? I have no idea. Or I just read, I hereby make a motion. There we go. I hereby make a motion for the planning commission to recommend the following zoning text amendments for residential buffering standards as underlined below, and to include any renumbering for the ordinance section with the discussed changes, commercial / or non-residential. How do we want to say that? Non-residential zones with the Scrivener's error corrected.
For suggested reasons.
And suggested reasons A through B, or A through D.
Okay. I think that
Man,
works.
that was bad.
It works.
I'll second that one.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion or debate? All right, we'll start with you, traveling Commissioner Wright,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox,
Aye.
Commissioner Kerr.
Nay, for the reasons you suggested.
I convinced one person.
I'm persuaded that it's better not to have it.
Commissioner Summerhays,
Aye.
Commissioner Daly.
Nay, for the same reasons as Commissioner Kerr. So,
And I'm a nay as well. So that one actually fails. Then I am going to, that actually surprises me. I thought for sure I was going down in flames on that. Then I am going to make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend the following zoning text amendments for residential buffering standards as underlined below, and to include any renumbering for the ordinance section, except with the following changes. Subsection B, the Scrivener's error alongside will be fixed. B1 will read non-residential, and subsection 2 will read residential minimum buffer depth shall be as follows. In high density zones meeting low density zones, 25 feet. For reasons A through D. So the intent there is that it will require the buffer between differing residentials that are 2 degrees of separation, and the only ones we have right now are high to low.
And I'll second.
oh, Mason.
Who wants to Mason? Okay, any further discussion or debate on that one?
So
My-
are you
my-
still keeping in the commercial to residential on
Yes.
that? Okay.
It will be any non-residential to
Okay.
residential.
And I'd like to just explain why I'm persuaded by that. It was the discussion with Corey. I know that we may feel sometimes that developers will sometimes cut corners. Few will cut corners. Others, and therefore need to be forced to have landscape buffers. But there are other developers who will not, and they'll recognize that having that flexibility is better than not. And I would rather give them an opportunity as they're infilling, because it's not like we've got large swaths of land for development like some other cities do. So I'm gonna err on the side of caution in this particular regard.
So Mason has placed on the record that he was persuaded by Corey and not me. Duly noted. Okay, I'm ribbing you there, Mason. Any further debate on this? If not, we'll go in reverse order this time. So Commissioner Daly.
Aye.
I'm an aye as well. Commissioner Summerhays.
I'm going to stop to say a name.
Okay, Commissioner Kerr.
Aye.
Commissioner Wilcox.
I'll go aye.
All right, Commissioner Wright.
Aye.
All right, that one passes. Thank you guys very much.
Who would have thought the developer's the only name on that one?
Okay, moving on to item number 3, which is a commission discussion only with regard to the general plan transportation element discussion. Before I turn the time over to staff, I apologize, guys. I have to leave a little bit early, but I have prearranged to turn over the time to Commissioner Daly, our vice chair, to finish heading up this meeting. So thank you very much, Vice Chair, and I will turn the time over and leave you guys to it. So thank you guys very much.
Thanks, Shailene.
Okay, turning it over to you, Corey, or Mackenzie.
Okay, I've just pulled up the staff report, and this one's a discussion. The idea, if it works out in the discussion, is to come back with any suggestions you have at your next meeting and potentially host a public hearing to try to discuss meeting the timeline of December 1st for reporting back to the state for this year's annual report on how the progress of our efforts on moderate income housing, as well as coordination with the transportation element. And so I went back and, I think the hardest part, just to preface this, is that it's a little bit trying to figure out a way to merge since we don't have a major transportation asset, we don't have a station stop or something really formal like that. We're just to coordinate our options with the growth of our community to try to, ultimately in that coordination, hopefully it could encourage some affordable housing in the city. I don't think the state is saying that you have to have a final result. They're more checking at your efforts to try to coordinate your plan so that the development community can take a look at your plan, your general plan and your zoning ordinances and see where they might be able to construct housing that may meet that standard. So as you recall, back in our transportation, I picked the priority items. The state requires us to look at like 23 different items and pick three, I think is their minimum. I think we picked 5. And most of our efforts in the general plan are focused on this accessory dwelling, accessory apartments, some infill overlay. And you picked, out of those elements, you picked these 3, if I recall correctly. The commission wanted to look at reduced regulations to accessory dwellings in residential zones. I think the Utah League of Cities and Towns is under doing that. I think Centerville has made that a goal, but coordinating that with the transportation plan, I don't think we're at a level in accessory dwellings to run out and say all neighborhoods in the entire city can do accessory dwellings. I feel that even the council at this point in time is still trying to feel for what would be appropriate in the city for accessory dwellings. And so my proposal is maybe the more appropriate place to consider is along these corridors rather than just passing a citywide ordinance for accessory dwellings. Put the opportunity for this to happen where transportation, the busyness of a transportation corridor already affects a piece of property that may be underutilized, might be in an area that has a substantial amount of traffic and could benefit from using their property in this transportation corridor with a little bit more flexibility for accessory dwelling units. And so I added a component related to the transportation corridor that we might consider doing that along for accessory dwellings. And so I list those transportation corridors that are basically our arterial streets, major collectors within the city, rather than the minor collectors and the local streets. The idea of accessory apartments is really similar to ADUs, but now you're not doing an owner issue. Your ADUs is where you're generally expect that the owner is living on the property. They're not buying it to cut it up into apartments. They're living on the property. They commit to a standard of owning and living on the property as a primary residence. And we've seen drafts, and hopefully in the past you've seen drafts on how that accessory dwelling unit works. It's usually an owner-occupied situation. But accessory apartments, you're not going to have an owner-occupied situation. This is the concept where we've talked in the past with the city council that Main Street might be a small corridor that we could look at for some accessory uses rather than try to add a whole bunch of density like the old South Main Street plan that's still in place, yet to be replaced, allows. And so this is the concept that you have a accessory apartment or two associated with commercial corridors. And so I list out where I think some commercial corridors could benefit. I use the 600 foot, which is our big block for Centerville. We're generally around 350, I think. But I use a big block for our commercial areas, and we can debate that. So I identified that. We also, and I'm not sure that you were fixated on this, but I included the reallocation of residential densities just for your discussion. Along the corridors where we have the different zoning districts, should we explore an overlay that adds some units per acre? And I just picked kind of the density. We're at 4 units an acre in low density districts, so maybe going to 5, which a lot of our subdivisions are R18 zones in the past. So they're minimum 8,000 square foot, or some of them are R110 zones that are 10,000 square foot. And so I don't see that in the corridors, adding 1 unit would be detrimental to the normal density layout of those older subdivisions in the city, meaning north of Parish Lane and some of the areas that are west of Main Street. However, I think the controversial 6 units an acre for medium and 8 units an acre for medium. If you remember, our general plan says medium is 8 units an acre, but the city council changed medium to only allow 6 units an acre. So we have a missing component of 8 units an acre in our current general plan. So should we maybe along those corridors allow the 8 units permitted in those commercial corridors? So that's something for you to debate. And the always thoughtful high density ratio of 12 units an acre, which is not fancied by a lot of people. So I think that's a number to debate also, if you're thinking of reallocation of residential densities in these corridors. And I picked the half block. Our Main Street plan says that commercial should not go more than a half block back, and that's approximately 300 feet, except for the O'Brien glass block. And then the last one that was put on the table is the lot infill. These are the idea that we might have some lots where an existing home, the parcel might be large enough, but we need to adjust setbacks or lot widths. And we could do that through an overlay on these corridors. So to be short, those are some of the parameters, and you can cut, paste, eliminate, change, whatever you want to do to these policies. But is there something, and it doesn't have to be all of them. I think we can also chew the elephant one bite at a time. Is there something that you favor or would favor if it was adjusted? So I'll turn it over to you, Chair Daly, to facilitate discussion.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Thanks for that explanation. You answered some of my questions that I had already, so way to head me off at the pass. That was pretty good there. Anybody else have questions for Corey on this?
I have a quick question. Corey, can you just explain so that we all understand the accessory dwelling units, how that is, sorry, I have no brain when I'm driving, apparently. I'm not driving, but I mean, I have a car. The sleeping overnight, what's the one that you rent what?
The short-term rentals, Airbnb.
Airbnb. Can you explain Airbnb with ADUs?
Sure. That's a great question to think about, because somebody might look at an ADU and say, this is a perfect place to rent a quick night out to a couple traveling and see it on an Airbnb. The first answer is that short-term rentals, according to Centerville's definition, would be a lodging facility or a bed and breakfast. They're in the same category. Currently, bed and breakfast lodging facilities are restricted to commercial zones. So short-term rentals in Centerville are technically not allowed in residential zones in Centerville at this point in time. However, I get calls every once in a while about, hey, there's an advertisement for an Airbnb in Centerville. And I can look up on Airbnb and I can find the place that's advertising that from time to time, and they've switched around. So obviously we don't have a lot of successful Airbnbs in Centerville on a regular basis, but the state has stepped in Lisa can remind me, 2 years ago maybe, and said, we need to handle this short-term rental at a state level. You go ahead with your zoning issues that you have in place. But the message that I heard through the training was that if cities start getting aggressive on short-term rentals, we're going to step in really fast about whether we're going to allow you to have zoning powers over short-term rentals. At the same time, the hoteliers are fighting short-term rentals because they want to argue about the hotel tax and whether Airbnbs are subject to that. What the Utah League and Cities of Towns have said, well, you as cities can go ahead with your zoning powers as you see fit, but our advice is don't get aggressive, because we want to work out this with the state legislature rather than having state legislature panic. And here was their cue on why the Utah League and Cities and Towns was concerned. Municipalities are prohibited currently from using Airbnb advertisements as an enforcement tool. So even though I can find on the website a place advertised, I am not currently allowed to use that as evidence against the Airbnb. So short-term rentals are prohibited in Centerville. We don't seem to be extremely prolific with them, but we could choose to enforce them if we decided to get aggressive. Does that answer the
Corey,
question?
Yes, thank you.
Corey, I just have a question on setbacks for accessory dwellings. I assume apartments, again, they're going to be subject to the commercial zone that they're in. But what accessory dwellings, what's the setback on accessory dwellings within their zones? Standard residential setbacks?
It depends on how you adopt them. The last version that was forwarded by the Planning Commission for a recommendation to the City Council that was subsequently installed at the council level only allowed accessory dwellings inside the main structure of the house. If that remains the case, then they will meet the setbacks typical of the home, 25, 8, 10, 20. However, I assume we will come back sometime in the future and re-have that discussion, and the question may ensue, do we want to allow detached accessory dwelling units, which creates an original uncomfortableness, but may be more practical in doing? And that's where we'll start to have to customize, what are those setbacks? Are they 3 feet, 5 foot? Are they 8 foot? How close can you build to a property line in a detached building on your property? So an example would be you build a 2-car garage in your backyard. Can I do, which I label, it may not be politically correct.
Corey, you're talking about the garage behind my house. Keep on going.
We called them granny flats when I lived in one. We lived above the 2-car garage when I lived in the accessory dwelling, and we called them granny flats. And yeah, I think that's a future discussion. How close do we want to allow, if that accessory dwelling has a dwelling unit in it, what are the future setbacks for it?
Yeah. Okay. That's a future discussion then, not what we're faced with currently then.
Correct. We don't have an ordinance.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Corey before we kind of move on to the next stage of this discussion? No? Okay. So I guess at this point, this is just a discussion for the Planning Commission, and Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're discussing this and kind of giving you further instruction on refining maybe these 4 points here to come back to us with a proposed zoning code amendment or something that we would do a public hearing on. And
correct.
Okay.
1 or 2 or 3 or all of them, or modifications, or even none of them, if that's what your wish is.
So I'll start then. As far as some of these go, the use of accessory dwellings and potentially even accessory apartments, that was part of this discussion I remember I talked about at our meeting we had before, which was we pretty much already have accessory dwellings within the city. They're just, illicit, I guess you could say right now. So I think it's worth exploring those for, to make that, let's legitimize those and let's talk about those a little bit more. The last 2 are a little bit tougher for me. The reallocation of residential densities, I struggle with that one, certainly where, the trend certainly in the city is to is less density, not more density. And so I think any kind of, for me, any push to allow more units per acre is not really something that I'd like to undertake right now. And then I think the idea of, and maybe some of the other commissioners could talk about maybe that last bullet point of creating a flexible lot infill overlay strategy. That one's an interesting idea to me. I don't really feel like I have strong opinions about that one or strong feelings either way about it. And maybe that's just because I haven't had, enough time to think about it, talk about it, hear what everybody else has to say. So I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on, these 4 bullet points. Which ones would we like to have Corey flesh out, or which ones do we just want to say thanks, but no thanks? Don't all go at once. Becky.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I always feel like I'm talking first. I'm like waiting to see. I'm like, maybe I won't have service later. So I am really interested in discussing accessory dwelling units for a number of reasons. We have a limited geography in our city, and I think having the ability to have owner occupied and owner controlled and owner oversight on these accessory dwelling units, to me, is a very, very safe way to allow for infill, allow for moderate or low income housing, and also to help the residents of our city, because a lot of what I've seen, and I know that I just have, my own experience, but a lot of what I've seen is people wanting to use and utilize their property in a way that they could still stay and remain in Centerville, but not have maybe a giant home with a big basement. And instead they have the opportunity to maybe rent it out to a son or daughter, or someone that they would feel comfortable living in their home. I feel like that's a very safe discussion that we can have. The second one, where it's not the owner occupied, I'm a little bit less excited about, just because I feel like the oversight there is not quite as tight. I don't love high density, but I think in specific corridor areas, I think Corey was smart about talking about, okay, these transportation corridors, this area that maybe we can look at a slightly higher density would make sense, not only because it would be like a place to put it, but I think the market would drive that. So I think the market would drive that, and I think people would be more apt to supporting something like that if it were not past that half block or that 300 feet. I do feel like we'd have to be really careful on how much we'd allow for that, and we'd have to be really careful on where that is located. So I feel okay with that. And then the last one, I also am really interested to kind of keep that discussion going. Corey, can you remind me, do we have a certain number of strategies we have to suggest, in order for this transportation funding? I thought that's what it was.
No, we have to pick under the state code for moderate income housing. I think we have to pick 3 strategies, which we've already done.
Okay.
Under the transportation, it's pretty open. Just coordinate your transportation with those goals.
Okay. So these are 2 different things with the moderate income housing.
Yep.
And the transportation.
So the transportation is much more flexible. They just want
Okay.
you to look at your transportation plan and coordinate it with your future growth.
But the moderate income housing is tied to transportation funds.
The moderate
Right.
income housing reporting, every year we have to do an annual report. If we don't, then that risks the allocation of transportation funds to the community.
Okay, that's where I was getting confused. So, yeah, that's my thought.
So Becky, on the accessory apartments, the non-owner ones, maybe not within the primary building. If we were to really kind of limit the allowed areas for that, because we had talked about doing that for Main Street, right? That was part of the idea that we had floated out there at one point about doing Main Street, is essentially putting in those accessory apartments. If we were to do that, but really restrict the areas that those would be allowed, would you be more comfortable with that? Or Is it a bigger issue for you than that?
I think it's kind of the issue of oversight, because that's why I really like the first idea. I've always been a fan of ADUs personally. I think it's a wonderful tool to support our residents and their needs, and it's a wonderful tool to address future housing needs in our area. So that's like my favorite. And I think the thing I don't love about that is the second option is just that oversight is hard to maintain if the owner's not on the property. However, I think, like you said, if it were in very select areas, I'm about as comfortable with that as I am with some of the density discussions, because I feel like if we were really particular about which area we chose, we could be smart about that and maybe be okay with those areas.
Okay, I have a stupid question. So the accessory dwellings, that's inside the house, right? Okay.
For our discussion right now. Like
Okay,
Corey
and then-
said, later we might have a discussion that will include not in
Okay,
the
so
house.
the accessory apartments are not in the house, or is that totally something different?
The owner would not be there.
Yeah, I think because we don't allow accessory apartments right now, we don't know the final outcome of what's acceptable. I'm just pointing out that it can be detached if you want, and it can be attached as part of the house if you want. The last version that went to the council limited it to the house only. I'm making the assumption that that may be the same value in the future.
Okay.
Just assuming, I can
think
make an
that's
argument that the detached is a better situation, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's a planner argument, not a community value argument.
I think that's a really good question, Christina, though, and maybe as anybody else weighs in, talk about how you feel about that accessory unit being part of the primary residence or being as a separate building or whatnot. So, because it could be either. I think that the safe way to go, in my opinion, is like Corey was saying, what had been previously presented to the city council is to say that we're just going to go with in that primary building, in the primary residence.
Okay, so that's
Yeah.
what we're gonna kind of focus on, is just in the residence then.
Well, we could do whatever the
Okay.
commission wants to do, but I think, in my opinion, that's the safe way to go, is in the primary residence. Mason, Christina, while you're at it, do you have some other thoughts? Do you want to?
Like I said, I really like the accessory dwellings in the apartments. I don't like the change of density really, because like you said, people are very sensitive to high density. And then I also had a question with the overlay. Is that building another house on the same property?
Associated with which value?
The last one.
The infill?
Yeah.
Yeah, the infill would be let's say you have a fairly large lot, but the house is in a position where if you tried to meet the width of the lots or the setbacks, it makes the second lot really narrow. And a flexible infill says, hey, in that situation, we'll flex those. Right now we require 60 feet of frontage, and maybe it would work with 55 feet of frontage. And so we would flex through that overlay along those corridors, the underutilized pieces of property that are not as ripe for development, because, often the major arterials, nobody wants to put up with the street traffic. And so we'd get some deep lots that may, if we flex the standards, they're big enough to have two homes, but given setbacks and lot widths, the existing home gets in the way. And so we can flex it a little bit to help them out.
I like that one. I like them all, but that third one really.
But Corey, would that discussion also center around flag lots?
And I think flag lots is a very different regulation than flexible lot standards. I see where you could make the argument is we're going to make a flag lot down to 25 feet, but I think the parameters of a flexible lot is more closely to you're just shy of being able to hit the standard lot, but your property's too large to leave one home on it. And so I think a flexible standard has a very narrow flexibility, where a flag lot would just open up where you can just have a 25-foot road to the back of the lot. And I think that's a different animal.
Could we have a discussion about flag lots with that infill flexibility, or what do you think?
Well, as a planner, I think flag lots will always come back. They'll fall in favor, they'll fall out of favor, and they'll fall back in favor. And every big community goes through that. Because there's going to be circumstances where, for an example is, work with Randy, the public works director. His father has I think it's just over an acre, but his lot width is only 70 feet wide. He cannot, even under a flexible standard, he needs a flag lot situation. And somebody in the future is going to favor that opportunity for him. So the question of the commission is do you want to resurrect with this council who did take away the flag lot? Do you want to resurrect that discussion with them or not?
I'm not sure I want to necessarily resurrect the discussion. I was just interested in see how it was playing out with that flexible frontage. I am torn between flag lots. I hate them and I love them because I hate them because they make for weird lots and they can sometimes bother neighbors in the back. But I love them also for the fact that a lot of our downtown Centerville area residents and some of these older lots, like, you know, the Randall property and others, they have these extremely deep lots, and it feels really hard to say to them, oh yeah, you can't actually, you know, utilize this or infill this in a way that would make sense. So I'm not sure I want to necessarily go that way. I was just interested to know how that would affect it.
I think you'll see it as a flag lot, but if you think on the west side of Main Street, about 1235, 1245, there's two new homes. One sits really deep behind the other one.
Yeah.
That was where a flexible lot would have worked better. And we didn't have flag lots. And so they divided the property with 60-foot frontages. Then later readjusted through easements the placement of the homes.
Huh.
And I think that was over creative. So it looks like much more of a flag lot. Had we been able to be flexible, you could have had two homes side by side instead of one in the back.
Okay.
But yeah, I think you would narrow the parameter. We would, for lack of better terms, flexible would be like 10% capability to meet it. You're within a narrow range. You're just shy of getting there, and we would flex it to do that for you.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
So,
Mason, you're up.
Yeah, Corey, I have a question for you. I think I understand the answer to this, but I'd really like some clarification to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding. Let's suppose that we have a good discussion here, you invest your time and effort, and we kick it up to the next level and it gets stricken down completely. What is the consequence to the city in terms of its resources and budgeting and interactions with the state? What's the downside of us trying to do something but ending up not being successful in anything?
Well, I think that's a great question. This is the crystal ball of what may happen. So December 1st, we have to send in a report for our biannual report. It just simply says, what have we done the past year to coordinate our plan with the moderate income housing? And so part of that could be seen in a negative light. We discussed something with our transportation plan, but we didn't really want to modify it too much. We think the transportation is good as it sits. The report is not, from my view of the report is you just have to report annually what your efforts have been. And I would say our efforts have been to look at the transportation plan in this light. And in this light, we didn't achieve a common goal. So next year, we'll come back and redo it again. But here's our report.
Right. And that's pretty much what I understood as well. But yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, but I was just going to say, I think that the league is working with the legislature to try and get cities to cooperate and to try to address affordable housing. And so if all the cities take that kind of approach that we're not going to do anything, then it will come down with more significant legislation. So I think we're just trying to make a good faith effort. And so my advice as staff to the city council is, you know, you need to make some effort. And we've said, these efforts are minimal. I mean, right now under the statute, they're fairly minimal efforts. You know, you pick 3 out of 29 things to work on. And staff gave them 6 and, you know, they whittled them down, but it's not a huge effort. So I think we just need to start making some sort of effort.
And my question was directed pretty much towards that, and I appreciate that. I look at this and I see 3 different levels of analysis. What do I like as a commissioner? And I actually like all 4. What should I ask as a commissioner staff to spend its time on that's going to be efficient use of time? Because I don't want us, you know, throwing things away into the wind if we know it's not going to pass city council. But on a 3rd level, what should we be doing to make sure that we don't have legislatures coming down with big heavy hammers? And I feel like there's a lot of tension between those 2. So my personal analysis on this is evaluate all 4 of these because I like them. But I would defer to the group and also especially to staff, because this is valuable time that you're going to be investing. And you probably have a better pulse on what's going to be able to pass the 2nd level than I do.
Well, I think Becky kind of highlighted the narrowness. If let's just pick the accessory apartments. I've listed a number of corridors, but if you narrow it down to the South Main Street area, that's a common place. Boom, I think that's a win. Because we're going to say consider it. Now we're going to go back with the South Main Street plan that was our goal still, and we'll just add that component into it. I think that's a win. I think that's common in the council. But yeah, people may not like the control of the accessory apartments, so maybe Becky's right. We narrow it down to where we find it acceptable, and we'll study that. I think accessory dwelling units is on the horizon with the council. I think the hiccup that I perceive to them is they're not ready to just say citywide, let's do this. So their question in the past was, I think we should do them because we have some of them here, but I don't like the way some of the regulations of the building code work. Can we fix some of that? But then where should these go? And I think if we say, study it along the corridors, come up with an ordinance, look at it along the corridors, see if that works. I think that's still a win. I would agree with you. Adding a bunch of density and reallocating that, probably not a successful strategy, even though we may like it. Infill, not sure the council is really briefed well about infill. It's something we did a long time ago. I think it has merit. And I think the council would recognize that maybe infill with a minor adjustment is a lot better than flag lots with a 25-foot stem. So I would narrow it, if I were to consider it, I would narrow it to productivity, to accessory dwelling units and along a corridor or 2 to start, accessory apartments in the Main Street corridor, and infill lay, let's go take a look at overlay and see if that's something better than flag lots. And I think that's a win.
So Corey, let me ask you this though. As I mentioned, we already essentially have talked about accessory apartments as part of our Main Street plan that we have put on the back burner for a minute. So if we were to tell you, go back and develop an ADU plan for that primary residence building, but don't spend any time on the accessory apartments because we'll come back to that when we get back to our Main Street plan. Would that'd work well too, wouldn't it?
Well, I think all of them are the way the language of general plan is to guide your future. You don't have to adopt the ordinance right away yet. We can have future discussions. You're just going to say, if you adopted the language, pick a couple of corridors for accessory dwellings. We would just say, hey, we've been interested in 6 accessory dwellings. We don't have an ordinance yet. And we're interested maybe in these couple of corridors. Let's have a future discussion about it. And we don't have to have an ordinance yet. We've just satisfied the goal to consider that in the near future.
Okay, that's a good distinction. We're just talking about general plan here, not the nuts and bolts of the ordinance.
Correct.
I gotcha. That's a good, I don't think I had made that connection quite yet. So that's a good point there. So then including accessory apartments into the general plan fits with our conversations that we've had about Main Street. Gotcha. Okay. Spencer, did you have anything to say or?
I've just been listening intently. So I think it's been a good conversation, and I like how Mason brought up the point that we could throw everything in the wall and see what sticks, but is that a wise use of resources? So I like your continuation of that point and Corey's note that, hey, maybe we ought to focus on items that are more, I don't know, sticky right now as opposed to not.
So, for me, based on the way that I've seen the city council vote and even including conversations I've had with individual city council members, the first two, I think, could stick, right? Like the first two have a chance. The last two, I think, are unlikely to stick. I don't think the last two have they don't have legs with the city council, at least in my opinion. And so to Mason's point, that might be, not time well spent. And so in my
Not
opinion,
even the last one?
Yeah, not even the last one. I feel like infill for some of the city council members might as well be a 4-letter word. So I could be persuaded, but otherwise we could include that and see what they do. But like I said, based on some conversations I've had with city council members, individual city council members, infill is not something that they're really excited about at all.
Well, I liked how Corey was talking about flexible setbacks. I don't think that we don't have to just say flag lots or do flag lots, but if we just have a discussion about that, I'd be interested in at least having a discussion about it personally.
Sure. I think it's, like I said at the beginning, I think it's worth discussing. I just, flexibility for the purpose of infill, I think that's where the city council might get hung up on it. But we can include it and talk about it and see what happens.
So I'll jump in on that particular point because the infill overlay is something that I'm keen on, because as I have been here in Centerville and on the planning commission, I see infill being a problem in the near to medium far away future. We ought to be getting in front of it. And although some might disagree with us, and maybe this is the first run that is unsuccessful, perhaps this is time well spent, that we lay groundwork, we do moderate steps, and we ask Corey to look at something not so specific as to be objectionable, but just to start opening the door, crack the nut just a little bit, and we'll look at things in further conversations down the road. So I would suggest, at least from my perspective, we don't worry about reallocation of residential densities. We do worry about ADUs of both types in greater detail than perhaps we might otherwise. But we do also ask Corey and staff to look at infill overlays, but not, gosh, how do I explain this? I don't want this to be objectionable, but I also want it to be opened for discussion. I don't know.
Yeah, you almost very ambiguous. At least just throw it out there as an option. Is that what you're saying, Mason? Saying
sort of
hey, this is an opportunity that we may want to look at. Period.
Identify that it's a concern, and identify that solutions need to be crafted, and that infill overlay is one of those solutions, perhaps. Because if it's just going in the general plan, that's good enough to start, maybe.
Yeah, that's fine. I can support that. Go ahead, Becky.
And I think too, obviously it's infill, but I think sometimes people hear the word infill, people who may not like infill, and they might be like, I'm not going to do it because it's infill. So let's have a discussion, and let's have a discussion about how we're talking about this that doesn't immediately close someone off to the discussion. So maybe even as we're talking about this as a planning commission and as Corey is presenting it, he can help us understand what that looks like so that people can actually, see what that looks like before they automatically say no based on what it's called. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's some good conversation there. I can support that. I think that maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe I'll be completely wrong and whatever. But yeah, let's present the idea and go from there. So Corey, I guess 3 out of the 4 bring them back and let's talk about them some more based on the conversation that we've had today, the discussion we've had today. Does that work for you?
Yeah, so what I'm going to go back is craft language that's not specific like you saw tonight. It's going to hit the goals and the policies. And then we can discuss if we insert like the South Main Street corridor into the accessory dwelling. I'll have those options that you can insert back into the language to decide how detailed you want to set the policy. Because I'm hearing infill is not to get too aggressive with it. Just bring up that we have underutilized properties. We have them along the major corridors. We need to look at small lot, not even called small lot, but flexible lot infill standards. Boom, we're done. There's no need for parameters on that. And so I'll do that so that we have some policy language drafted up, then options to paste in if you want a little further detail. And then we go to the public hearing and see how the response is from the public.
Perfect. Thanks, Corey. All right, let's move on to our the next item on our agenda, which is actually the Community Development Director's report and City Council report. Do them both at the same time. Go ahead, Corey.
We do have a project for your next meeting, and then we'll carry forward the transportation language for a public hearing. And the Hive development did pass City Council. We split up. We tortured the commission by putting Summerhill Lane and the Hive on your same meeting, and staff learned from that moment, and we split Summerhill Lane to the 20th and the Hive first. So the Hive did pass council. So there's my report. And you, of course, where we are, transportation, residential buffering, we discussed tonight.
Perfect. So you didn't want a 5-hour city council meeting for the Hive and Summerhill Lane?
I would have been fine with it to get it out of the way, but they had other items they wanted to discuss, so I didn't win the argument.
Nice. Okay. Thanks, Corey. All right, let's go on to the last part of the agenda then, which is the review and adoption of our minutes, or approval of our minutes. We do have 2 sets of minutes, mainly because the one meeting was a short turnaround meeting. Kind of because of that, I guess, right off the bat, that meeting was on Monday, September 14th. So the header on that first set of minutes needs to be adjusted to reflect a Monday instead of a Wednesday, which, headers are often overlooked. But we'll go through this in the usual manner. Go through this page by page. The first set's only 3 pages long. So anybody else have anything else to talk about on page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Great. Let's see. Do we normally do this in one motion or 2? We can do 2. We can do 1, right? Do it at the end. Okay. Then the second set of minutes, which definitely felt like a 12-page meeting. Anybody have any comments for page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Page 4? Page 5? Page 6? Page 7, page 8, page 9, page 10, page 11, and page 12. Nobody had any adjustments to that one, huh?
That's incredible. I just want to say, who took notes for that meeting? That's incredible.
Yeah, that was a good one. It was a long meeting, and to capture it all like that, I thought it was well done. So
I agree.
Okay, I will entertain a motion then.
I move to accept the meeting minutes from the Planning Commission meeting of the September 14th, 2020 and September 23rd, 2020 as unamended.
I'll second.
Great. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
I
Any opposed? Great. And the final motion? Motion to adjourn, anybody?
Oh.
Motion to adjourn.
you get to do it. Oh,
Oh, Spencer got it.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. We have a second?
I'll second
I'll
that too.
Christina, got it. All right. All those in favor say aye.